Will come to order. In recent months, the committee has held 3 hearings, 2 with Commissioner Werfel, 1 with Secretary Yellen, in which Republicans have attacked the Inflation Reduction Act funding for the IRS. The first bill that the House Republicans passed in 2023 repealed the bulk of the funding. Repeal is the centerpiece of Senator McCarthy's default plan, which would also destroy 780,000 jobs and increase the odds of a recession. By all outward appearances, repealing this funding is the Republicans' top economic priority. That's why the Finance Committee meets this morning, to break down point by point all the harm repealing would do, especially as part of the overall McCarthy plan. First, I'd like to focus on the major setback for criminal law enforcement. As a way to frighten typical taxpayers, Republicans have fabricated a whole score of stories about 87,000 armed agents busting down the doors at local businesses and people's homes. This is nonsense. The truth is, the IRS has a modest but critically important team of law enforcement personnel. They work on busting human trafficking rings, drug cartels, and enablers of child exploitation. They root out individuals and groups who finance the terrorists. They help crack down on criminal tax fraud and evasion, including the kind of evasion the Finance Committee identified with our 2-year investigation of how Swiss bank Credit Suisse enabled a group of dual U.S. and foreign citizens to cheat on paying U.S. taxes. At the moment, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division is working with partners in Ukraine to hunt down crooks who are evading sanctions on Russia. Recently, the criminal investigation collaborated with the FBI, the Department of Justice, and law enforcement partners around the world on the largest fentanyl distribution takedown in history. It resulted in hundreds of arrests and the seizure of $54 million and 850 kilograms of drugs, including the equivalent of millions of lethal doses of fentanyl. Republican cuts reduced the workforce of criminal investigation special agents by 26%. Democrats passed IRA funding to help rebuild it, but Republicans now wish to repeal those funds. Others say that the funding ought to be targeted elsewhere. So, to me, the question is, colleagues, if you want to cut this enforcement spending, which criminal activity do you propose letting slide? Drug rings, money laundering, sex trafficking, and child abuse? Yesterday, addressing this issue, the committee received a letter from the Federal Law Enforcement Officer Association opposing the Republican plan. This is a group representing tens of thousands of federal law enforcement officers from across dozens of agencies. Without objection, I'll put that into the hearing record. Second issue, coming off the smoothest tax filing season in many years, the McCarthy repeal plan would once again clobber taxpayer service and force Americans to spend hours waiting on hold with all that music in the IRS. House Republicans are hiding the ball on this issue. The McCarthy plan would leave the temporary IRA funding for taxpayer service in place, and Republicans will insist that's proof that they're interested in maintaining better service. Here's what the Republicans aren't telling the American people. The McCarthy plan would also hit the IRS with across-the-board budget cuts, just like the ones that steadily wrecked taxpayer service before Democrats were able to start fixing things last year. Nobody is asking for a return to 10 or 15% call response rates at the IRS. Third, the McCarthy plan to repeal the IRS funding would lead to a $120 billion increase in the deficit. How would this plan offset the deficit increase? By kicking people off their health insurance, increasing child hunger, worsening education, weakening border security, and those are just a few of the examples. With that said, if you want to see who the big winners are of the McCarthy IRS defunding plan, it's billionaires and corporations who cheat on their taxes. The Inflation Reduction Act funding for the IRS was designed to make sure everybody paid what they owe. Repealing that funding is a $191 billion giveaway to wealthy tax cheats. The effect of Republican IRS cuts has been clear. From 2010 to 2017, when Republicans cut most aggressively in terms of the IRS, audit rates for millionaires went down 77%. For large corporations, 44%. For complex partnerships, down 80%. Performing those audits takes a lot of hard work by skilled staff, and the IRS has lost 40% of those agents. Republican cuts shifted the burden of tax enforcement onto working people. That's because auditing them is easy. An audit of a simple individual's taxpayer return takes 5 hours on average. Auditing a higher income tax cheat takes an average of 250 hours. Corporate audits and audits of large complex partnerships can take even longer, sometimes several years. They require big teams with lots of expertise. Republican budget cuts systematically dismantled much of that expertise in the previous decade, and the McCarthy plan would decimate it in the years ahead. I'll close by saying the McCarthy plan, in my view, will lead to more tax evasion by the very, very wealthy. Worse taxpayer service for law-abiding Americans, and especially, colleagues, this is why I documented example after example, fewer prosecutions of drug cartel members, sex criminals, sanctions evaders, and money launderers. There's not a member I know of who supports those objectives, but that's what is really involved here. Lots to discuss. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. Senator Thune is our ranking member today. We always like working with him. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden. And while Ranking Member Crapo was unable to attend due to a prior commitment, it's a pleasure to briefly fill in on his behalf. And I look forward to continue working with all of my colleagues on this committee, especially in regard to responsible stewardship of taxpayer dollars. Today we're going to discuss the IRS's supplemental funding provided in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. The Chairman has a particular interest in the House-passed Limit, Save, and Grow Act and how it could impact IRS enforcement activities. Since the Finance Committee has yet to hold a hearing dedicated specifically to the $80 billion allocation, I find it curious that some prefer to focus on a House bill related to this funding rather than the effectiveness or oversight of the funding itself. Nevertheless, here we are. Last August, with the narrowest of majorities, Democrats gave the IRS approximately $80 billion, a sum equal to 6 times the agency's 2022 budget. Of the $80 billion provided the IRS, more than half, about $46 billion, is directed toward enforcement activities, which includes increasing audits and hiring more enforcement agents. But only 4% of the $80 billion, 4%, was earmarked for improving taxpayer services. That is an overwhelmingly disproportionate amount directed to increased enforcement compared to taxpayer services. The National Taxpayer Advocate herself criticized the lopsided funding for enforcement. Since the IRA's enactment, Democrats have doubled down and made calls to further supersize the IRS enforcement arm. The President's budget seeks an additional $29 billion on top of the $80 billion in supplemental funding to the IRS for enforcement, again, in addition to the $46 billion for enforcement the IRS received only months ago. For context, the IRS's supplemental enforcement funding amount alone eclipses appropriations for Customs and Border Patrol, which received approximately $18 billion in total this year. Based on funding priorities, it seems that Democrats intend to create a bigger and more intrusive enforcement-focused agency without annual accountability to taxpayers and Congress. While Republicans are open to discussions about IRS resources, efficiency, accountability, and improvements to taxpayer services should be prioritized, all of which are lacking in the Inflation Reduction Act. Some on the other side of the aisle will say that the IRS needed $80 billion to address the tax gap, refill the agency's coffers, and tune up the agency's customer service. But that's hardly the case. First, the tax gap. The difference between taxes owed and paid has been steady for decades, and this committee should pursue bipartisan measures to narrow it. But any such effort must strike the appropriate balance between taxpayer responsibilities and taxpayer rights. Simply flooding the IRS with $80 billion in unchecked resources will not magically yield $700 billion in additional tax revenue, a fanciful estimate that President Biden made 2 years ago. Policymakers need to be honest about what is doable with respect to the tax gap and instead focus on encouraging voluntary compliance, as the current and former national taxpayer advocates argue. It should also be noted that tax compliance levels in the U.S. remain substantially unchanged since at least the 1980s. According to recent IRS data, about 84% of taxes were paid voluntarily and on time. After enforcement efforts and late payments were taken into account, about 86% of taxes were paid. As the former taxpayer advocate Nina Olson has said, most Americans pay their taxes voluntarily. And data show that increased enforcement adds a small fraction to what the government collects. Second, IRS budgets have been generally stable for at least the past 2 decades. Aside from the agency's all-time high budget of 2010, which spiked under all Democrat rule, the IRS's funding has remained broadly in line with historic norms. The argument that Republicans have somehow starved the agency simply does not hold. And to the extent that IRS budgets have been out of the norm, there is a lot of direct correlation with a decline in employee headcount, as some of my Democrat colleagues claim. The IRS's employee headcount has been declining for several decades regardless of the growth or contraction of the IRS's budget across dozens of Congresses and multiple presidential administrations. Third, the IRS's recent funding windfall lacks any binding reports or oversight measures. As Ranking Member Crapo recently put it, and I quote, "The IRS has embarked on a spend first, plan later approach that is not transparent or responsible and is a surefire recipe, I should say, for error, waste, and mismanagement," end quote. And I have to say I couldn't agree more. The IRS's Inflation Reduction Act Strategic Operating Plan, which was recently released more than 45 days late, was big on platitudes but short on details. But I was interested and disturbed to learn from the plan that the IRS intends to spend $3.8 billion of the allocated $80 billion on, quote, energy security. Energy security, by the way, in this context means implementing the IRA's climate tax agenda. By almost any reasonable measure, the non-binding plan is instructive in how ineffectual a plan is without timely updates, clear data on costs, and meaningful oversight from Congress. To address this gap and to better track taxpayer services, I introduced the IRS Funding Accountability Act with Senator Grassley and the Improved Reliable Services Now Act with Senator Collins. Pumping the brakes on new enforcement activities from the $80 billion funding allocation until basic accountability measures are met does not account to protecting wealthy tax cheats, as some have suggested. It's about the responsible stewardship of taxpayer dollars. We have an excellent panel before us today. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Thune, and we are going to have a spirited discussion. Let me introduce our guest. Professor Sarin is an associate professor of Yale, a professor of law at Yale Law School, and she has talked with us often over the years on tax issues, and we appreciate her good work. Mr. Ford is the Director of Investigations at Costellantis, LLP. He served as Chief of Criminal Investigation at the IRS, and I think his testimony today and his availability for questions will be very helpful. Our next witness is Mr. Peter Sepp, President of the National Taxpayers Union. He leads NTU's government affairs effort. Before coming to NTU, he served with the St. Louis County Board of Elections and with the U.S. Senate campaign. I've talked to Mr. Sepp often over the years. And then we have Mr. Chris Edwards, the Kiltz Family Chair in Fiscal Studies at the Cato Institute. All of these individuals are experienced. We're going to have a good debate. Let's start with you, Dr. Sarin. We're going to make your prepared remarks a part of the record in their entirety. If you could summarize your views, that would be very helpful. Dr. Sarin.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Thune, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to share my views on the generational opportunity to improve our tax system presented by the Inflation Reduction Act's $80 billion investment in the IRS. One of the privileges of my time at the Treasury Department was having the chance to travel and visit IRS campuses across the country. I traveled to Kansas City to meet employees who gifted each other the red pens they needed to circle line items on returns that they would transcribe by hand because the IRS couldn't afford to buy them. I traveled to Austin, where unprocessed returns dating back to the pandemic were stacked in the cafeteria because there was nowhere to store them. I traveled to Ogden, Utah, to an IRS job fair, where frontline employees were pridefully recruiting future civil servants, describing the months they had spent in person at the outset of the pandemic, ensuring that the tax system would continue to run. The case for the Inflation Reduction Act's much-needed investment in this beleaguered agency is clear. That said, it is unlikely that the IRS is going to win a popularity contest anytime soon. One IRS colleague explained the reality to me as such. No one likes the IRS, and that's okay. We're the tax collector. Who's going to like the tax guys? Even though the IRS might not be the most popular part of the U.S. government, it is among the most important. The agency collects 96% of the revenue that funds the government. It touches just about every American household and business each year. Over the last several years, it was responsible for dispersing critical support to millions of families. It has done all this for far too long without the resources in place to serve American taxpayers or administer the tax laws the way the American people deserve. Now, thanks to the IRA, all that has changed. Already this filing season, the IRS achieved an 87% level of service. And those backlogs are gone, and IRS employees have their cafeteria back. The IRS has also begun to overhaul its tax compliance efforts. This is an area where the agency's work has been subject to substantial confusion and misinterpretation. So I would like to make 4 points about noncompliance in our tax system and the importance of the IRA's investment. First, the tax gap, the difference between owed and collected taxes, is large. More than 2% of GDP on an annualized basis, or about $600 billion a year. To get a sense of that magnitude, consider this. If the United States was able to collect the taxes that are already on the books, absent any other changes, the deficit would shrink by nearly half. Second, the tax gap is concentrated. The top 1% is responsible for nearly 30% of the measured tax gap. And that number is likely an understatement because the IRS has struggled to estimate the noncompliance of high-income individuals and the corporations and pass-through entities that they own. It is exactly here that an under-resourced IRS has lost the most capacity. In the last decade, multimillionaire audits declined by more than 80%. And audit rates have been approximately zero for complex tax structures like partnerships, which represent more than 35% of business income today. So this is where new enforcement resources appropriately will be focused. Third, there is a lot of revenue at stake. In my new paper with former Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy, Mark Mazur, we estimate that the IRA's investment in the IRS could raise around $560 billion in new tax collection in this decade, and more than $1.5 trillion over the course of the next 2 decades. But fourth, this is about more than just revenue. It is about fairness. We have underinvested in the IRS for years. That has created an inequitable tax system where the vast majority of your constituents pay all that they owe, but some who earn income in opaque ways, disproportionately the wealthiest, do not. That is why the IRA is so critical. To be sure, there is an implementation challenge ahead, but with multi-year funds and a commissioner at the helm with both public and private sector management experience, the IRS is finally set up to succeed. Yet, it will need help. In the years ahead, it will be critical for Congress in its oversight capacity to continue to monitor the progress of the IRS. I am keen to talk with you about how to ensure this funding is spent in a diligent and careful way. And it will also be paramount to preserve and supplement in the discretionary appropriations process the historic investment the IRA made in our tax system and in our nation's fiscal health. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarin. We will have questions for sure. Mr. Ford.
Thank you. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Thune, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the need for consistent funding for the Internal Revenue Service to address both critical service updates for the taxpayer experience and sufficient support for enforcement activities. As the former chief of the Criminal Division of the IRS, or IRS-CI, I've witnessed firsthand the important role that enforcement plays in promoting voluntary compliance with the nation's tax laws. I understand that my role at this hearing today is to talk about the real-life impact of funding cuts on federal law enforcement. So let's start there with law enforcement. The Criminal Investigation Division is the 6th largest federal law enforcement agency in the United States. There are currently about 2,100 special agents in IRS-CI. The high water mark for CI special agents was in the late 1990s when IRS CI had approximately 3,600 special agents. Even after the planned IRA-funded hiring, CI will not surpass that number. I think it's also important that we call these law enforcement personnel special agents and not just agents to avoid any confusion with revenue agents who do enforcement on the civil side of the IRS. This confusion in language and misrepresentation of facts over the last 6 to 9 months is careless and dangerous, and has been the cause of threats to men and women who serve this country by investigating some of the most dangerous crimes in our nation. IRS CI is the only agency with the authority to investigate and recommend prosecution for violations of the federal tax code. IRS CI forms the backbone of voluntary compliance regime that our tax system depends upon. The fact that you can be incarcerated for committing felony tax crimes in the United States provides a strong deterrent to those looking to take unfair advantage over their neighbors and business competitors. Because of this, you can literally draw a straight line on a graph that shows a decrease in compliance as staffing for CI goes down. Without sustained funding for rigorous enforcement, the system of voluntary compliance will continue to erode. IRS CI services are in high demand by both the Department of Justice and by the U.S. Attorney's offices around the country. There are simply not enough resources to sufficiently work all the priorities of the IRS and the DOJ. Unlike the civil side of the IRS CI does not have full control over the cases they work. Every case worked by IRS CI, whether it's a tax case or another federal criminal violation, is worked in partnership with the Department of Justice and the U.S. attorneys who prosecute the cases. I witnessed firsthand the impact that IRS funding cuts have on enforcement. Difficult choices must be made involving investigative priorities, and investigators had to walk away from many strong cases because there simply weren't enough special agents to handle the demand for their expertise. In addition to being the only federal law enforcement agency authorized to investigate federal criminal tax violations, CI also works a variety of high-profile, high-impact cases at the request of the Department of Justice due to the financial investigative expertise that is unmatched. CI participates in sanctions investigations involving Russian oligarchs, corrupt politicians, and those who facilitate the illicit movement of money on behalf of sanctioned individuals or organizations. Just last week, IRS CI made news by training 3 Ukrainian law enforcement agencies with the help of private sector partners in cryptocurrency and cyber tools. You may recall the high-profile case in 2019 called Welcome to Video, a case initiated and led by IRS CI. This case led to the seizure of the largest darknet marketplace for child exploitation, resulting in over 330 arrests around the world and 23 kids saved who were being actively abused. In 2020, CI led an investigation revolving around cryptocurrency fundraising for several terrorist organizations, including Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. This concluded in the largest crypto seizure tied to terrorism to date. Earlier this month, the Attorney General announced results from Operation Spectre, which was a coordinated international effort that spanned 3 continents to disrupt dark web, fentanyl, and opioid trafficking. CI led multiple cases under this umbrella operation. These cases are not what you think of when you think of IRS criminal investigation, but the expertise and reputation of the agency has developed in more than 100 years is exactly the reason that CI is needed on these cases. The men and women of IRS CI are often behind the scenes and don't seek the spotlight, but their extraordinary work is critical to the success of U.S. law enforcement efforts. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Thune, and members of the committee, thank you again for the opportunity. I believe the additional funding provided for the IRS and the IRA is a long overdue game changer for the agency. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fort. Mr. Sepp, welcome.
It's an honor to be here, Chairman Wyden, Senator Thune. I promise I won't present on all of these materials at once, but I do hope we will actually get to these materials. It's very important for all of us to recognize a few realities here today. First of all, this amount of funding for the Internal Revenue Service has never been accompanied by so little detail. Case in point, the 1998 IRS Restructuring and Reform Act preceded by a 200-page report, 184-page long bill, Taxpayer First Act of 2019, preceded by upwards of 4 years' worth of hearings, stakeholder engagement, a 250-page implementation report. We got 9 paragraphs in the Inflation Reduction Act to describe an agency transformation. We also need to recognize, though, on the Republican side of the aisle, that the House bill clawing back the funding will never get past this committee, much less to the President's desk. We need to accept that reality. And the Democratic side, of course, I would hope, would accept the reality that federal law enforcement agencies have always been built with guardrails, and Democrats have been at the forefront of doing that. Maybe we can come together with those realizations and figure out how to move forward. Let's also realize that while we argue about how much money can be raised here, like revenue angels dancing on the head of the pin, there's the point to the pin, the sharp end. And that sharp end is going to affect everyone in America. We debate over a $400,000 audit threshold. We're getting some clarity about that. But the point is, in the strategic operating plan, the IRS is admitting that there will be other enforcement activities funded by the new money that will touch all taxpayers. Audits are just one tool in the compliance toolkit. So it is with the revenue estimates. CBO has gone back and forth on how much money this IRA enforcement funding will raise. They say a net of $100.4 billion. Is it 50.2? Is it 150.6? That again misses the purpose. Unless we get the agency transformation right, those revenues are not going to materialize anyway. That's why we need to get to work on a number of important items to make sure this agency transformation is a success, not only for the agency, not only for raising revenues, but for taxpayers themselves. How do you do it? There's a turnkey operation, the IRS Oversight Board, that has remained dormant since 2015. It still gets funded. Let's get nominees before this board. Let's create a safe space for the White House to do that. Get that board up and running. Let's make sure we have off-ramps for these new enforcement efforts. We need a working appeals process. Congress has spoken on this for the better part of 100 years. The IRS pushes back with rulemakings that limit the right to appeal. We need global settlements that will allow the IRS to sweep aside issues in courts that are relatively non-controversial but are taking up a lot of resources. Settle those and move forward so you can focus your legal resources. Look at alternative dispute resolution. That's something that Senator Cornyn has introduced in legislation this year, the Small Business Taxpayer Bill of Rights. We need to examine and evaluate in detail this funding cliff for taxpayer services and business modernization. That's coming up very quickly. Appropriations may not be this committee's purview, but you can certainly make recommendations in that regard. We need to look at alternative compliance strategies. Compliance is the end, not enforcement, and there are many ways to get there. I'll put in a word for tax simplification. Of course, that aids compliance. That's a whole other hearing topic in and of itself. But let me say that there is plenty of bipartisan legislation from Senator Grassley, from Senator Wyden, from Senator Cardin, former Senator Portman, lots that we can build on. And we're here to help with that, with the Taxpayers First Project, an assembly of Democrats, Republicans, former IRS officials, current experts in academia, all of them ready to help on this important project. It's said you can walk and chew gum at the same time, that the IRS can do this. Well, they not only have to do that, they have to read a book, drive a car, they have to play a ping pong game, and they have to be a lifeguard at a swimming pool all at once. That task is going to take a lot of building. Let's get to work now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Sepp. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you very much, Chairman Wyden. Well, the IRA, as we've heard, included $79 billion of new mandatory funding for the IRS. 57% is going toward enforcement, but just 10% for taxpayer services and technology upgrades. In the President's budget, which includes this additional funding, enforcement spending will more than triple over the next decade. Enforcement outlays will grow from 38% of the IRS budget today to 61% a decade from now. That funding is off kilter. As Senator Thune mentioned, the National Taxpayer Advocate said, quote, funding in the IRA is disproportionately allocated for enforcement activities. Congress should reallocate IRS funding to achieve a better balance with taxpayer service needs and IT modernization, unquote. I think that's correct. The CBO says that the $79 billion new funding will raise $180 billion over 10 years. But that doesn't mean that the new enforcement spending is good for the economy. More aggressive enforcement would mean higher costs on taxpayers. Higher enforcement would mean collateral damage on law-abiding taxpayers because the IRS makes many mistakes. Consider disputes that end up in tax court. For cases closed in the last 5 years, the IRS only got 48% of the dollars it demanded. So the IRS made a mistake in half of those cases. Similarly, IRS auditing imposes collateral damage because many audited taxpayers have already paid the correct amount. More than 40% of partnership audits result in no recommended changes. For individuals earning more than $5 million, almost 40% of audits result in no change. And given that those audits are driven by IRS algorithms, those are high shares of targeted taxpayers who did nothing wrong. Of course, the IRS needs to enforce. My point is that there are downsides, including higher costs for families and businesses who have already paid the correct amount. Also, if you look at data from the GAO and elsewhere, the marginal benefits of audits declines as auditing increases. The latest federal IRS estimate of the gross tax gap is $540 billion, which is 2.6% of U.S. GDP. The IRS tax gap as a share of GDP has actually fallen a bit over the last 2 decades from 3.3% back in 2001. Over recent years, despite the decline in audit rates, the tax gap was 2.7% of GDP a decade ago. It's only 2.6% today. So the extent of taxpayer errors and cheating has not increased. It's really not changed much at all. There's a number of studies that have compared tax gaps across countries. The studies, I think, are rough estimates, but they generally show that the U.S. tax gap is about the same or smaller than typical tax gaps in Europe. There are 3 better ways to boost tax compliance than jacking up enforcement. First, keep tax rates low to reduce incentives for cheating. The average corporate tax rate across the OECD countries has plunged from 48% in the early 80s to just 24% today. But corporate tax revenues as a share of GDP are actually higher now than they used to be. With lower rates, there's less incentive for avoidance and evasion. Second, taxpayer compliance would rise if we improved IRS services and technologies. The new strategic operating plan from the IRS has tons of good ideas to make these improvements. And third, Congress should simplify the tax code. Rising complexity invites abuse. The past taxpayer advocate said complexity, quote, facilitates tax avoidance by providing criminals with opportunities to commit tax fraud, unquote. I think that's exactly right. Unfortunately, rising tax complexity is making the IRS's job much more difficult. In a really interesting report last year, the GAO found that for high earners, the average audit hours per return has more than doubled since 2010. I think that reflects the rise in complexity in the tax code. Recently, all the expanded energy breaks in the tax code would cost billions of dollars for the IRS to administer, and they will generate higher compliance costs, more abuse, and more lobbying, frankly, which is all pretty unproductive for the overall economy. So in sum, the official IRS data show that the tax gap is not rising compared to GDP. Also, the U.S. tax gap appears modest compared to other countries, but we can reduce the tax gap by cutting tax rates, improving IRS services, and simplifying the tax code. So my bottom line is I think that with the $79 billion in new IRS funding, some of that ought to be moved back away from enforcement activities and more towards the taxpayer services and the IT investment that the IRS is promising in their new strategic plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All of you have been very helpful. And I'm going to start with you, Mr. Fort. You were from 2017 to 2020, Chief of Criminal Investigations at the IRS. Is that correct?
Correct.
So recently we learned about how this particular part of the IRS collaborated with other law enforcement agencies on the biggest fentanyl distribution takedown in American history. Hundreds of arrests, seizure of millions and millions of dollars, 850 kilograms of drugs. I mean, this was the equivalent of millions of lethal doses of fentanyl. And the office that you headed up was a key part of enforcement efforts from 2017 to 2020. So House Republicans now want to cut these IRS enforcement measures that we included by over $45 billion. Now, they swear up and down that they're for law enforcement, but with respect to the people, the agents, we should be doing more with less. So when it comes to investigating complex financial crimes, the kind of work you did, the kind of work recently that the office where you were was part of this whole effort, what are the implications of trying to go along with this Republican mantra of, in the criminal area, doing more with less?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Wyden. As I mentioned in my opening statement, IRS criminal investigation has very broad jurisdiction of tax crimes, but also, as you mentioned and I mentioned in my opening comments, in a very important relationship with the Department of Justice and other federal agencies investigating child exploitation, narcotics trafficking, the opioid epidemic. Less money, less funding means less cases. And for the criminal side of the IRS, that means less tax cases, less sophisticated international tax cases, but also less involvement in the cases that you mentioned, these critical involvement with U.S. law enforcement investigating serious narcotics crimes, including the opioid epidemic, terrorist financing, sanctions investigations, and a whole host of other priorities for U.S. law enforcement.
Let me ask you about another one, and that is offshore tax evasion. I'm very pleased that our investigative staff exposed just how a few American families were hiding hundreds of millions of dollars at Credit Suisse, and how one U.S. software executive managed to hide an astounding $2 billion in income offshore for more than a decade. Part of the reason why is Republican budget cuts hamstrung this enforcement program for the get-go. In 2021, there were just 7 criminal investigations opened into offshore bank account violations. That number strikes me as preposterously low. Preposterously low, given the magnitude of offshore tax evasion out there, which has been estimated at about $15 billion per year. Again, let's hear about how the Republican mantra, doing more for less, is going to help us figure out where these wealthy tax cheats are hiding money offshore. It doesn't seem to me that what the Republicans are talking about is going to be helpful as we try to get the very people that we recently exposed.
So it's another great question. There's tremendous work left to be done on international tax enforcement on the criminal side and the civil side. Again, this work is critically important to what the IRS does. There are more cases than the 7 that you cited. There's many international cases, but there's so much more work to be done. And in cooperation with the civil side of the IRS, there are sophisticated schemes. More and more, it's very typical for IRS criminal investigations to involve some type of an international component. These cases are incredibly manpower intensive. They're typically multi-agency investigations led by the Department of Justice that require legal process to get evidence and witnesses from overseas. So there's a lot more investment that can be made and many more cases that can be worked in this area.
Let me ask one question of Dr. Sarin. We've appreciated all of the input on issues you've given us over the years. What do you think about this idea of auditing wealthy tax cheats, and somehow the Republican argument is going to get it done with the IRS doing more with less? We've had now 2 specific examples, this huge fentanyl takedown, the Credit Suisse effort that Mr. Ford has talking about doing more with less. What do you think the consequences of these cuts are in our effort to really go after the issue that you and others have been looking at for years, which is we've got the information on middle-class people. You know, they pay taxes with every paycheck. It's these wealthy tax cheats we've got to zero in on. Your thoughts about doing more with less, as the Republicans are talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Chairman Wyden. The reality is the IRS can't do more with less. And let me give you another precise example with respect to complex partnerships. In 2019, the IRS opened audits of 7,500 partnerships. It received more than 4 million partnership returns. That is an audit rate of 0.05%. The reality is this is a signal to taxpayers that the IRS is simply outgunned. It has no capacity, and those who want to evade do so freely. What these resources are going to mean for the IRS and what not having these resources will mean for the IRS is that finally the agency is going to have the capacity to hire the people required to pour through thousands of pages of incredibly complex structured tiered partnerships that are owned by tiered partnerships and designed as such precisely to be opaque in ways that are impossible to pierce and allow for evasion.
Thank you very much. All of you have been excellent. I'm just going to close with this. I'm over my time. But Mr. Sepp talked about guardrails. We're all for guardrails. What I think you have said, Mr. Fort, and you have said, Dr. Sarin, is that McCarthy budget would do a lot more to unravel our ability to take down the wealthiest tax cheats. It's not about guardrails in that McCarthy budget. It's about unraveling the ability to take them down. Senator Thune.
Mr. Chairman, you, given the overwhelmingly disproportionate funding toward enforcement activities compared to taxpayer services, do you agree that some of the IRA enforcement funds could be more effectively spent on improving customer service? And could you just elaborate on that point a bit?
Thank you, Senator Thune. Yes, certainly they could. And the problem with the 9 paragraphs in the Inflation Reduction Act that describe how the IRS money will be devoted to various functions, I think it fails to account for overlap. In the taxpayer services category, for example, it specifies that certain amounts of funding will go to taxpayer advocate services. In the enforcement side, certain amounts of funding will go to litigation. In the IRS Strategic Operating Plan, in the enforcement section, there's an item describing how the service wants to put more people into appeals. You've got overlaps among the funding that we don't really understand yet. And I think we need to consider holistically that, yes, taxpayer services and other items can increase compliance. At a recent symposium by the Tax Policy Center, Nina Olson, the former national taxpayer advocate, says, we're good at measuring non-compliance, or at least we think we are, when it comes to audit rates and the like. What about compliance when taxpayer services improve? We've not measured that impact sufficiently. I think one of the most telling quotes came when Ernie Dronenberg, who was a former revenue official from California, he made the equation this way: a 0.5% increase in voluntary compliance raises $400 million a year for his state. Doubling the audit rate raises half that much.
So would having the IRS update its IRA spending plan annually and requiring regular oversight hearings before the relevant committees of jurisdiction provide some of the greater accountability of the $80 billion funding that we're talking about here? And maybe if so, could you talk about how?
Well, I think that Congress can't go at it alone. There certainly has to be a series of reports set up for the agency to describe in detail where the money is going, and answering this question of how exactly this funding for auditing high-income individuals is going. There's, of course, the Criminal Investigation Division, whose funding is very important, but Commissioner Werfel himself has said their hires for CID will be somewhere around 3% of the total they intend to hire. If we want to keep funding CID, that's a pretty minor amount of increase. We can do that.
Right.
There are other things, though, that have to come along with it, like preparing the IT infrastructure for going after cyber criminals. Treasury Inspector General recently said that the IRS failed to meet 17 of 20 standard cybersecurity criteria developed government-wide. If we're going to be dealing with the worst of the worst in cyber criminals going forward, we need to have a secure infrastructure that isn't going to be hacked.
And oversight and accountability that come with it. So, Mr. Edwards, in your testimony, you state that the IRS estimates show that the tax gap's not rising relative to the size of the economy, and the U.S. tax gap appears to be modest by international standards. Could you elaborate on how the U.S. tax gap stacks up against other countries, including those in the EU?
There's a number of studies internationally. It is difficult to compare tax gap between countries. Few countries do detailed tax gaps like our IRS does, but there's 5 or 6 studies I cited in my testimony that look at tax gaps across European countries and the United States. Generally, our tax gap is lower as a share of GDP. They're different, which is a little surprising. I mean, Europe relies a lot on VAT taxes, which are actually easier to force compliance with than income taxes. So, you know, and our tax gap has not increased over time. You can look at the IRS tax gap estimates back a few decades, and the tax gap has not increased. And here's the important point with enforcement, I think, is that it's not all black and white, but there is diminishing benefits when you increase enforcement. There's a fascinating chart in the GIO study last year on enforcement that shows if you look at people earning over $5 million, today when they're audited, 40% of them have no tax change. A decade ago, when the audit rate was higher, 60% of them had no change. So if you expand the auditing on wealthy people in this case, you make more errors. You go after a lot more people who haven't cheated, who haven't made errors. And you know, one of the reasons is a lot of high-income folks, they hire expert CPA and CPA companies who don't want to make mistakes. They got their reputations online. And if you look at the auditing data in the annual IRS data book, the folks at the top end actually on audit, their mistakes are smaller relatively than people in the middle. So I think it's a bit off base to say that there's all this cheating going on at the top end. Of course, there's some. We need to enforce it. But the relative error and cheating at the top end is smaller, actually, than in the middle and at the bottom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's expired.
Senator Grassley's next.
Mr. Edwards, we hear from people at the administration, nobody under $400,000 is going to affect by all this additional money we put into the IRS. But at a recent hearing, Commissioner Werfel stated that this threshold will be based on total positive income, which is a measure of income that excludes losses. So won't basing the audit threshold on total positive income result in significantly larger audit pools than if the IRS used adjusted gross income or taxable income? Isn't this particularly true for small business owners?
Right, so the administration has promised that they won't increase audit rates for folks who earn under $400,000 a year. But my understanding is, you know, the IRS uses the total positive income metric to target their normal auditing, and so when the commissioner says that, you know, uses the $400,000, he's actually talking, as you said, about a broader pool, mainly small, mid-sized businesses who actually may have AGI under $400,000. But if they're looking at positive income without losses, you're going to get a much bigger pool. I haven't done the math to figure out exactly how many returns that is, but there will be a broader pool of businesses who are audited than just thinking about the $400,000 as if it was AGI.
Mr. Sepp, I was a member of the 1998 IRS Restructuring Commission, and that act, IRS received multiple years of funding to upgrade its information technology. This funding was supposed to enable the IRS to replace its outdated individual master file and business master file, which still use technology dating back to the 60s. However, that attempt was plagued by cost overruns, lack of functionality, and to this day, the legacy system persists. What steps could be taken whether by IRS or Congress, to ensure that we don't end up 2 decades from now with the same legacy systems?
Well, thank you, Senator. Yes, the individual master file is probably the central core of IRS data that needs to be upgraded and replaced. The Commissioner has set a very ambitious goal of trying to do that in the next few years. That could very well get delayed. We saw a $4 billion attempt in the late 80s and early 90s to try and update IMF. There was the enterprise case management system where IRS basically ignored the advice of technological experts who were saying you're focusing on the wrong kind of contract and the wrong kind of upgrade. I would say that even though the IRS now has a CIO, a Chief Information Officer, we've got an acting one right now, which is not ideal. You should really have a permanent one in place. But I would refrain that having consistent managerial oversight through something like the IRS Oversight Board that you and my boss worked on and the IRS Restructuring Commission would be ideal. And in fact, I know that there has been work done behind the scenes with members of this committee to try and make sure we never have this quorum problem with the board again. That would be well worth looking at to make sure we have managerial consistency when these upgrades are made. And frankly, there's not enough money for business systems modernization in the IRA funding mix. The projections are we'll burn through about 1/3 of that before another 2 fiscal years have passed. That money's not going to be around for the upgrades, and it's a key foundation for everything else the IRS wants to do.
Mr. Edwards, we often hear from people that are behind this massive amount of money that's going to be given to the IRS that anyone who's not a tax cheat has nothing to worry about from increased IRS enforcement. Even if an audit results in no additional taxes due, a taxpayer can still spend countless hours and incur significant costs responding to the IRS. Can you discuss the costs and burdens an IRS audit imposes on even an innocent taxpayer?
Well, that's right. That's one of the downsides of increased enforcement is that the IRS makes lots of mistakes. And, I cited the statistic, for example, that if you look at tax court cases over the last 5 years, the IRS gets it wrong about half the time. The court decides that the IRS only got about 48% of the money that they had demanded. And that's after, the audit and appeal. The IRS brings these cases are brought to court, and the IRS only gets about half of the money. So there's a lot of false positives, I guess you could say, in IRS enforcement. And the more enforcing you do, the broader the pool of enforcement, the more mistakes the IRS is going to make. And it causes, especially for 30 million small businesses, a lot of headaches and wasted time and effort defending against the IRS when people have done nothing wrong. So I had my own issue with the IRS that it took me about a year to handle. I had to hire lawyers, and I found out through that process that the IRS makes lots of mistakes. They misfile forms. The groups within IRS don't talk to each other. You can't get anyone on the phone. I could have resolved my issue in 15 minutes on the phone with an IRS employee. I had to hire a law firm, spend thousands of dollars to get the problem solved. I ultimately had to get the National Taxpayer Advocate to come to my aid, and we solved the problem. But it just struck me that a lot of this is actually it doesn't have to do with money. It has to do with management in the IRS, sharing data, having a common database, being able to call and get someone on the phone like an airline reservation system where they have your information in front of them, and they'd be able to solve the problem a lot.
The time of my colleagues expired. Senator Carper is next in order of appearance.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't always time my arrival this well. We've had a lot of hearings going on today. It's a run up to a 2-week recess, and I think every chairman of the committee is trying to make sure they have their hearings done today, tomorrow, as well. But we're grateful for you to be here, and have a special interest in these issues. It goes back a long way. But we thank you for joining us today, and someone who cares deeply about fiscal responsibility. And I care a lot about customer service, hugely care about customer service. When I was a little boy, I used to go back to West Virginia to my aunt and uncle's supermarket just off of the turnpike in Beckley, West Virginia, called Patton's Market. And you go into that store, and it would say, welcome to Patton's Market, friendliest store in Beckley. And my grandfather was a butcher, and my aunt and uncle ran the place, and if you walked in that place, man, they knew your name. If you needed a special cut of meat, my grandfather would get it for him. If you needed home delivery, they'd deliver. If you needed to charge it, this is before we had credit cards, they'd charge it and all. But I learned a whole lot about treating other people the way you want to be treated. There's a great quote, and as it turns out, I think it's Mark Twain. People don't care how much you know until you know how much they know how much you care. Isn't that a great quote? No, it's Teddy Roosevelt. It's Teddy Roosevelt. It's not a likely quote you'd hear from. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And when I was governor of Delaware, the Delaware Division of Revenue, which basically was the state version of the IRS, won my last term. They won the Delaware Equality Award for best service of any government or a nonprofit or business in the state. And so we highly value, and I still highly value customer service. But I want to talk a little bit today, or ask you to talk a little bit about today, about the fiscal impact of cutting in investments in the IRS rather than reducing our deficit. The repeal of the IRS funding in Speaker McCarthy's bill would unfortunately actually add nearly $120 billion to the deficit. It should not be a partisan issue to support the idea that people should pay the taxes that they owe. And that is especially true for corporations and wealthy individuals who make up a large share of the tax gap. I want to make sure I pronounce your name correct. Mr. Seren? Ms. Doctor, excuse me. Doctor. Is that right? Seren?
Seren is great, yeah.
Oh, that's good. Has anybody ever mispronounced your name?
My parents say it different ways, so.
Oh, that's good. I feel better. Give them our best. How does funding for the IRS bolster the fiscal health of our nation? And how would the repeal of these investments I just alluded to impact taxpayer compliance?
Thank you for your question, Senator Carper. As you mentioned, the CBO has sort of commented on this question and has remarked that the IRA would raise nearly $200 billion in new tax collections, or around $115 billion net of the IRA investment over the next decade. I have a new paper out with former Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy Mark Mazur this week that addresses this question as well. And we conclude that while directionally definitely right, we think that the IRA investments are likely to raise much more, around $560 billion over the course of the next decade, and around $1.5 trillion over the course of the next 2 decades. And the reason for that is that as the IRS starts to build up enforcement capacity in these areas that you speak of, Senator Carper, global high net worth, complex partnerships, high-end evasion, where they essentially have no capacity today, what you're going to see is direct revenue coming in from those enforcement activities. But what you're also going to see is you're going to see taxpayer behavior adjust very substantially for these investments. And particularly, taxpayers who make errors that are identified by the IRS, we know they're unlikely to make those same errors in future years. And there's also a community deterrent effect when taxpayers and tax preparers realize that the IRS is on the beat. They adjust their behavior accordingly and are more compliant voluntarily.
Thanks. One more quick question, if I can. This tax filing season, we've already seen tremendous progress in the ability of the IRS to provide good customer service for taxpayers. It's really encouraging. In fact, during the 2023 filing system, I think the agency was able to answer nearly 90% of phone calls. I have a friend who says, compared to what? Well, compared to like a year ago, when I think it was like 16% of calls being answered. So a huge improvement. I think it's due in large part to the investment we've made in the IRS. Questions for you, Dr. Seren. Can you talk with us just briefly about, and you've already done this a little bit, just a bit more about what the repeal of this funding would mean for customer service that the IRS provides to everyday taxpayers seeking support? Thank you.
And it's entirely because of the investment you made. So the IRS was able to hire 5,000 new people to be on the phones. The level of service grew to 87% from 15% in 1 year. The IRS was able to digitize thousands more forms this year. The IRS cut phone wait times from 27 minutes to 4 minutes. This filing season is proof in concept of what a resourced IRS is going to be able to deliver for taxpayers. But we're not at the level of customer service that your market is able to provide just yet. And what the agency needs to do over the course of the next few years, and what you see them allude to in the strategic plan, is invest in taxpayer service that allows the IRS to meet taxpayers where they are. So that means phone service. It also means in-person assistance at taxpayer assistance centers. But what it also means is you should be able to communicate with the IRS digitally and instantaneously, if you want to, on your phone, the way you can communicate with your financial institution today.
My
Yeah, thanks for the time. Thank you.
Senator Johnson.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Edwards, first of all, I agree with you. I think the overall solution here is to simplify our tax code. That would solve all the problems. That's the root cause, a very complex tax code. I fear that the $80 billion is just a $80 billion Band-Aid. It's not going to work. And of course, what I'm concerned about, I expressed this with Commissioner Werfel as well, is that $80 billion will not be spent in an impartial way. Highly concerned about partisanship in these federal agencies, law enforcement, and the IRS. And we've got two examples. Mr. Chairman, I hope we can get your cooperation with trying to extract information on the IRS visit to, for example, journalist Matt Taibbi. We got a response. It's a non-responsive response, but we'll continue to follow up on that. But I want to talk about another thing that's just popping in the news in terms of partisanship. And Mr. Chairman, you received a letter, together with Ranking Member Crapo and Senator Grassley, from the attorney for a IRS whistleblower who's claiming partisanship in a high-profile IRS investigation. They are asking for whistleblower protection, and they're asking to be interviewed, and my understanding is that they don't want to be interviewed by the House and the Senate. They'd like to do it one time. You know, I would request that you cooperate with their request. I'd ask that you enter this letter into the record. Mr. Chairman, can you enter this letter into the record?
Without objection, so ordered.
And I would also ask, if we do arrange that interview, I would like to be part of that interview. I'd like to be present when we interview that whistleblower, because the news reports widely are assuming that that is Hunter Biden. And of course, the chairman's always talking about wealthy tax cheats. Well, let's describe a wealthy tax cheat. Hunter Biden became a board member on Burisma in April or May of 2014. 3 years later, his financial advisor, business partner, the Biden family financial advisor, Eric Schwerin, sends him an email saying, hey, Hunter, you understated your income by $400,000 in 2014. I mean, this is 2 or 3 years later, right? Now, eventually, Hunter Biden paid about $2 million of delinquent taxes, but he didn't pay them. A Hollywood attorney named Kevin Morris made that payment in May of 2022, 5 years after Mr. Schwerin told him that you underreported income by $400,000, where he must have underreported income by a lot more than $400,000 if he's making a $2 million tax payment. So the concern we have now, according to this letter, is that entire IRS investigatory team has been pulled off the Hunter Biden case. My question for you, Mr. Fort, in your time in the IRS, in the investigatory division, the criminal division, was there ever another instance where an entire IRS investigatory team was pulled off a tax case?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So yeah, I've spent almost 30 years with IRS criminal investigation. I'm not aware of a situation such as that, but again, when I retired from the organization at the end of 2020, I was in charge of about 3,000 people, including 2,100 agents, so I can't say with certainty whether or not that happened.
So again, we have a whistleblower here. He's seeking whistleblower protection. Sounds like the House has granted it. I'm not sure what the Senate is doing. This is the committee of jurisdiction. I hope you grant whistleblower protection and cooperate in an interview with this whistleblower, because we need to find out this information, claiming partisanship in the Hunter Biden investigation. And now, the fact that the Justice Department has removed the entire investigatory team off of the case, that just smacks of partisanship and erodes the American people's confidence that the IRS will be fair and impartial and administer justice in the tax code equally. I mean, do you agree that that erodes confidence in the IRS, this recent revelation?
So even though I've been gone from the government for 2 years, federal law prohibits me from discussing any specific taxpayer at all. But I would just agree that it's a serious allegation.
Well, again, and having an IRS investigatory team pulled off of any case would certainly get you scratching your head, right? Highly concerned about what's pulling off here?
Again, in my experience, I'm not personally aware of a situation such as that, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen during my tenure.
Okay, and again, Mr. Chairman, I would also like your cooperation in my request for information from Commissioner Werfel on the Matt Taibbi. We're going to try and get from Mr. Taibbi a release to have the IRS release those records, because right now the IRS is claiming they can't do that. We also asked, by the way, general questions, which the IRS also didn't respond to us. So I'm going to need your help if we're going to get to the bottom of that potential partisanship within the IRS.
I'm going to respond when you're done. You're just over your time. Are you done?
Yep.
Great. I am aware of the matter that Senator Johnson's brought up, as has been my practice on 6103 protected matters. I have been pursuing this issue on a bipartisan basis here with Ranking Member Crapo, and we are going to continue to do so. Given 6103 and the sensitive nature of the information for all involved, there just isn't anything more I can say about it now. Okay, Senator Daines is next.
Chairman, thank you. I'd like to begin my time by addressing the flawed notion that the Inflation Reduction Act's $80 billion in supplemental funding to the IRS will somehow spare ordinary Americans from increased audits. For years, my Democrat colleagues have called for the IRS to reduce the tax gap, the difference between total taxes owed and collected by targeting wealthy tax cheats. Fortunately, we still have some common sense in Montana. Montanans know that the most dangerous words in the English language are, "I'm from the IRS and I'm here to help you." They know the IRS can't handle the workload it currently has, so adding more money to enforcement before we get folks to answer the phones is fruitless. The other problem is low to middle income earners represent the major source of underreported income. According to the Nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation, as much as 90% of the money raised from underreported income would likely come from those making less than $200,000 a year, with only 4 to 9% coming from those making more than $500,000. Again, that's from JCT. The nonpartisan GAO also found that most of the revenue generated from audits over the last decade has come from returns with incomes below $200,000. In fact, when given a chance to guarantee the IRS couldn't use additional funding to audit taxpayers earning less than $400,000, every Senate Democrat voted against it. With nearly 60% of the IRS's supplemental funding going to tax enforcement, audits are unfortunately coming for Americans at all income levels. More aggressive IRS enforcement is likely to increase costs for honest taxpayers who are forced to spend time, a lot of emotional energy, defending themselves against erroneous audits. Mr. Edwards, in your testimony, you state, and I quote, "IRS auditing imposes collateral damage because many audited taxpayers have paid the correct amount," end quote. What are some of the external consequences that taxpayers face as a result of the IRS's increased enforcement?
We all want to increase compliance rates, and there's two ways you can do it. You can improve the IRS, you can keep tax rates low, you can simplify the tax code. All of those strategies would save taxpayers money, and you'd increase in compliance. Yes, you can increase compliance with higher audit rates, but there, as you said, there would be collateral damage on the many people who get audited, go through all the anguish, the lawyer costs, and all that financial uncertainty, and they paid the correct amount. And as I said, there's an interesting GAO in a GAO study on auditing last year. They have a chart showing a decade ago when audit rates were higher on the top income category above $5 million, 60% of the time there was no change on audits for those taxpayers, meaning the IRS, even though they target with algorithms, they made a mistake 60% of the time when went after the wrong people. So, you know, I don't know what the exact right audit rate is, but the more you audit, the more mistakes the IRS will make.
Mr. Edwards, in your testimony, you touched on this, on the prevalence of so-called no-change audits, in which the IRS audits taxpayers only to find out that they paid the correct amount. In fact, you stated that for individuals earning more than $5 million, the no-change rate is just under 40%, meaning in 40% of these cases, the IRS is expending time and resources forcing individuals to exhaust their own time and resources for no reason. Mr. Edwards, the Biden administration has said that the enforcement budget will only go towards auditing high-income taxpayers. I think we've already demonstrated that this is at best a flimsy claim, but let's say that's true for a moment. Is it really a good outcome for anyone besides tax attorneys to have the IRS increasing taxpayer costs and stress by forcing them to defend themselves in these audits?
That's right. So that's a GAO statistic that for the very top end people, 40% of audits, there's no change. And even the returns where there are changes, a lot of those get abated. Some of them go to tax court, and in tax court, as I noted, that the IRS only's got about a 50-50 batting average. So there's a lot of people, the more you audit, there's a lot of people who have to go through a lot of time and expense and financial anguish and lawyer fees to defend themselves when they've done nothing wrong.
Time of my colleagues expired. Senator Casey's next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here for your testimony. I want to start with Dr. Sarin. We're grateful for your presence here today, and I wanted to specifically talk about the question of performance and what's happened just in our recent history. You mentioned in your testimony the IRS has increased its customer service performance 315% over the year, answering 2 million more calls this year and serving 100,000 more taxpayers in person. The IRS has also digitized returns, cleared paper backlogs, and reduced processing times on tax returns. That means, obviously, more taxpayer money is getting back into families' pockets. If the Congress were to cancel the increase in IRS funding, as House Republicans have proposed, what would happen to, number one, in-person taxpayer services, and number two, call wait times for people in Pennsylvania, for example?
Well, call wait times would rise. Last year, without the IRA funding, call wait times averaged 27 minutes. This year, they averaged 4 minutes, and that is a direct result of your investment. What would also happen is that in-person assistance at taxpayer assistance centers would decline. It declined over the course of the last decade by 50%, disproportionately because the IRS was forced to close taxpayer assistance centers in rural, low-income communities because it couldn't afford to staff them. This year, it did a terrific job in increasing that in-person assistance, but there is a ways to go, and these investments are so critical. They're also critical in enabling taxpayers to have real-time access to the IRS and real-time digital access to enable them to have their tax questions answered more quickly and to quickly resolve any issues with the agency. And I know this is the direction that all of your constituents want the agency to go. They now finally have the resources to do it.
Thank you, Doctor. I want to turn to Mr. Fort, and I'm grateful for your public service as Chief of the IRS Criminal Investigations. Over the last decade, IRS Criminal Investigations team has lost one quarter of its special agents. who do the work of investigating criminal tax violations, dismantling terrorist financing operations, and recovering billions in stolen assets for American taxpayers. The House Republican proposal would make sure we never rehire those criminal investigation agents. You've personally had a hand in some of the most high-profile investigations at the IRS, like when 2 Chinese nationals were charged with laundering $100 million after hacking a cryptocurrency exchange. I wanted to ask you first about the special expertise that the IRS brings to criminal investigations. What kinds of criminals are able to escape justice when we defund the IRS?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So IRS criminal investigation has a very broad jurisdiction. I'll direct the question primarily to the multi-agency investigations that IRS criminal investigation works, such as the case that you mentioned, child exploitation, many narcotics investigations around the country. IRS they're in high demand. The resources of IRS criminal investigation in high demand with the Department of Justice and other agencies. And it's really a multi-agency effort where every agency brings their skills to the table, and it's the skills of IRS special agents in following the money that's so critical in solving these federal crimes.
Well, I appreciate that. And how many, just for purposes of the record, how many years have you done this work?
I did it for a little over 29 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Senator Blackburn is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being with us today. So the IRA gives the IRS an additional $80 billion. And you've got additional funding that is on top of the $13.6 billion it received in annual appropriations in 22. And about 60% of this funding is designated for enforcement actions. And so, Ms. Aaron, you wrote an article in Washington Post saying that this is not enough. So how much do you think would be enough? Where do you peg that number? When does government get enough of the taxpayer money, or do they ever get enough?
Thank you so much for your question, Senator Blackburn. I really appreciate it. And a point that I think is important to emphasize is that these $80 billion, this $80 billion investment in the agency is about transforming the IRS into a 21st century tax administrator. It's about creating a modernized IT structure so that IRS employees aren't hand transcribing returns. What they're doing instead is scanning them digitally and automatically when...
So you think they need even more money on top of what they've gotten so that they can audit more of the American people and use technology to delve into those audits? Mr. Sepp, I want to come to you. A letter that the National Taxpayer Union wrote to Congress last year before the passage of the IRA, a section was included that speaks to what would happen if the IRS received increased enforcement funding with the goal of aggressively pursuing increased revenue. When I talk to Tennesseans, they don't agree with Ms. Aaron. They think the IRS has too much of their money as is. It is. The letter goes on to say, and I quote, taxpayers would be right to ask, would the agency first direct their efforts at expensive, time-consuming, in-person audits of wealthy taxpayers and corporations, potentially facing legal challenges in the process, or would the IRS devote its time and manpower to additional correspondence audits from under-resourced low- and middle-income taxpayers, end quote. Now, of course, we know the IRS has only 50 to 55% of their personnel that are working in person. The rest of them are still working remotely. And if we also take into consideration that the Biden administration has chosen to keep audit rates at 2018 levels, which according to the 2022 IRS data book would still lead to over 262,420 taxpayers making less than $25,000 per year being audited. So do you believe that it is a valid concern for taxpayers that I hear from all the time, that they're concerned that the IRS is going to use this money as a slush fund to target them, to target small business people, and to cause them a lot of extra expense, as you were just discussing with Senator Daines.
Well, thank you, Senator. A lot to unpack there. I would just say, first, we have the notion that innocent people have nothing to fear from heightened enforcement activities.
But sometimes it costs them to prove their innocence.
Because
the IRS many times considers them guilty unless they can prove that innocence.
That's right, and we would never be making that statement with any other area of law enforcement, in my opinion. We would be saying, trust but verify.
Right.
And in this report, of course, if you read the IRS's strategic operating plan, they are very careful to point out in the enforcement section where they are talking about limiting audits at the $400,000 TPI and up level versus broad-based enforcement efforts that are going to affect all taxpayers.
But as we have heard from Commissioner Werfel, that is going to be what he terms positive income, which is everything. That is your gross.
Yeah.
That is not your net. That is your gross. That gets a lot of mom and pops. Mr. Edwards, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with what Pete said. I would. There's a heck of a lot of good stuff in the strategic operating plan regarding taxpayer service and technology. I think both sides can win. Taxpayers can win. We would all win if there's oversight on the IRS to make sure that those promises are fulfilled. We can save taxpayer money by investing in taxpayer service, holding their feet to the fire, making sure they make those customer service changes would be good for all of us. I would also say there's a lot of stuff in the strategic operating plan that actually shouldn't really cost money. I mean, there's a whole page in there on saying that forms and notices should be in plain language. Well, they should be doing that already. They should have been doing that for years. And as someone who's received some of those notices over the years, I can tell you they're hard to read, and which makes no sense.
And it requires you to get an attorney.
Absolutely.
Which is costing you money, compliance, and you've done nothing wrong. We hear it from Tennessee businesses all the time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. I heard you say that the strategic operating plan had plenty of good stuff in it. So I heard it loud and clear. Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks very much, Chairman. Mr. Fort, I think we've talked a bit about what IRS, I used to call it CID when I was U.S. Attorney. And by the way, you were all terrific to work with. It was really an impressive law enforcement agency, so thank you for your service there. We've heard a number of the areas in which the criminal investigation work of the IRS takes place. Would it also include terrorist financing?
Thank you for the question, Senator Whitehouse. Yes, it would.
And international money laundering?
Correct.
And sanctions evasion, for instance, by Russian oligarchs who park money in the U.S. and other places?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Sirene, I think you are familiar with the 501c programs of the tax code.
I am.
What's the status of 501c enforcement right now at the IRS?
Well, Senator Whitehouse, I think this is an incredibly important area, and it's one, like much of what we've talked about, like partnership, like global high net worth, where as the IRS has had resource constraints, they just haven't been able to invest in this work. And it's part of what I think is so important going forward, because really investing in a tax administrator that's able to have a real enforcement presence across the code is kind of central to our democracy. It's central to the functioning of American society. Right now, we live in a world with a two-tiered tax system where the vast majority of your constituents are doing exactly what the IRS requests of them. But disproportionately, those on the high end are choosing not to. And disproportionately, certain organizations and large corporations and complex partnerships are causing the IRS to be in a situation where they're not complying with the law.
So
and that's why this is so important.
Specifically, 501c3 and 501c4 organizations, they are required to operate within fairly precise legal constraints, are they not?
That is correct.
But there doesn't seem to be much enforcement happening to keep them within those bounds set by Congress. Is that also correct? And
this is an area where I know you've discussed this with Commissioner Werfel as well. This is an area where, and the analogy he used, I think, with you was the IRS needs to have refs on the field. in order for the rules to be followed and the game to be played.
Yeah.
And I think this is an area where there is a considerable role for both Congress and the IRS to play in making sure that we invest in the importance of enforcement and following the rules.
Well, it looks like the Wild West with the sheriff sound asleep right now, so I hope that will change and that these resources will help. Let's just propose a hypothetical here. Let's say hypothetically that one party of a country was supported by polluting industries, that it got away with enormous levels of pollution for free, putting the burden of its pollution on everybody else in the country, but not paying to prevent or clean up its own pollution, that as a result, vast fortunes were created, and that the owners of those vast fortunes deeply resent being taxed like ordinary people, and therefore set up complex schemes to hide their income and their assets, including even overseas. If you were in that hypothetical as one of those individuals, would defunding the tax police be a logical strategy as a part of that operation?
If you were one of those individuals, you certainly would want an IRS that's not resourced to be able to pursue you and your tax evasion and your crimes. And I suspect, and it's been kind of disheartening to watch critics of the IRS line up and so much money be lined up against the IRS's activities here, that's exactly what you're seeing.
Couldn't agree more. I yield back my time.
I thank my colleague. Senator Tillis is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Edwards, you've written extensively on the subject of the tax gap. And I think you've found that the tax gap is not growing relative to the size of the economy. I'm curious about that. Can you explain what it means?
Well, every few years the IRS does a tax gap study. They do based on what's called the National Research Program, which are random audits. They take the random audit information. They sort of gross up the amounts compared to account for income that they think might be there, but they can't find, and they come out with their tax gap estimate. They came out with their most recent one last year. They found that the tax gap now is around 2.6% of the GDP. If you look at the IRS studies back a couple decades, frankly, even further, the share of GDP that is the tax gap, tax error, and tax cheating has been about the same. I mean, it appears from the official data that the amount of cheating or an error on tax returns is about the same. You're never going to get it down to zero. And I also looked at my testimony on the information. It's kind of rough what happens in European countries. In Europe, the tax gaps seem a little higher than the United States. So I think Americans are generally pretty law-abiding on their taxes.
Well, I was going to ask you about the OECD. I think you answered my next question, but we're in the same ballpark?
They are. There are some countries that are lower than us, both Canada and Britain. They do detailed tax gap analysis like we do, and their gaps are a little lower. But there's a lot of European countries actually that have higher tax gaps than we do, so we're kind of somewhere in the middle.
Okay. I was here for the opening statements of the chair, and the IRA and the $80 billion to the IRS, as somebody who spent most of my career doing enterprise transformation. Here's how I would describe the IRS. They've got a lousy customer service record. They understand that problem. They're trying to fix that problem. They have antiquated systems and processes. And so I'm trying to figure out, and I do think, I voted for the new head of the IRS because he has background in enterprise transformation. I have to believe that he's looking at this gift of $80 billion and saying, gosh, I wish I could spend it the way an enterprise transformer would spend it. And one of the things I wouldn't do is spend $15 million on creating a government alternative to something that's working just fine in the private sector called free filing. There are tens of millions of people currently qualified. If we were going to put that into something that could expand the footprint, that makes more sense. So the concern that I have with the IRA, unlike how it's been characterized, is that you're not planning ahead for how you should transform the IRS. You should take a look at the performance indicators that need to be fixed and spend the money that way. Instead, We've said almost double the size of the IRS. It's not going to all be with agents. It's going to be spread out, but there are going to be a significant number of people that are going to be added to an organization that desperately needs to be modernized and invest in technology. And in fact, I think if you were to spend every dollar you would spend in artificial intelligence to try and find the cheaters, not the people who made mistakes. We do casework every day in our office for somebody that's dealing with an unpleasant customer experience with the IRS, trying to just fix an error. So let's separate the errors from the cheats. Get every dime you can from the cheats. But I think we're using brute force and labor versus a well-thought-out plan that I'm fully convinced we've got leadership that would do it if we allowed them to. Do you think it makes sense for us to go in and create a competitive product for the private sector on free filings? Mr. Edwards? Anybody that wants to speak?
No. The IRS in the strategic operating plan has an enormous amount of transformation on their plate that they've got to deal with. There's it's not just spending more money. There's management reforms, an enormous amount. And like I said, there's a lot of good stuff in the strategic operating plan. But until they get there, pouring more money into new endeavors doesn't make any sense. We need a fundamental transformation. I must say, you can fundamentally transform government agencies. I think the current Postmaster General, for example, is actually doing a very good job in transforming the Postal Service, and it's got a lot of similar problems as the IRS. So we need the transformation first before we go expanding the duties.
Yeah, and that, I wanted to ask questions of the other witnesses, but that's what happens when you do something on a bipartisan basis versus something on a partisan basis. The Postal Service bill that I supported and worked to get good support had 79 votes. Well thought out. This one, not so much. That's why we need to go back, reopen it, try to, even if you don't change the top line number, you need to change how it's spent, what the priorities are, if you're really going to have a positive impact on the taxpayers. Thank you,
I would
Mr.
just
Chair.
quickly add, Senator, that in December of 2022, there was bipartisan legislation being developed by two committee members here, Senator Cardin and Senator Portman, that would have created an Office of Transformation for the service.
The time of my colleague has expired. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Time and again, my colleagues across the aisle have hijacked negotiations to avoid default in order to extract spending cuts in the name of fiscal responsibility. It seems a little hypocritical to me for congressional Republicans to threaten default and call for spending cuts on the back of working families when they depleted the revenue side of the ledger over the last 5 years. Dr. Sarin, how much did the 2017 Republican tax law add to the federal deficit over 10 years?
Over 10 years, several trillions, around $3 trillion.
So that's pretty significant. Now, I'm proud I voted for the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually cuts deficit spending, while supercharging investments in renewable energy. It also provides resources for the IRS to modernize its IT system, restore customer service, and hire the personnel necessary to collect the taxes that everyone, including wealthy individuals legally own. So I think that when you give a couple of $1 trillion away, it's a little disingenuous to then say there should be all these spending cuts on the backs of individuals, working families that are going to make a difference in our economy. Over the last 10 years, the IRS budget shrunk by 20%, resulting in 20% of its workforce being laid off. And while middle-class families and small businesses bear the brunt of the IRS customer service problems, wealthy individuals and large corporations are all too happy to take advantage of the IRS's limitations. Ultimately, that means less revenue to cover the cost of our federal budget. We're already seeing improvements at the IRS due to the Inflation Reduction Act. Customer service has significantly improved. The IRS is planning to hire the personnel needed to ensure that the wealthiest are paying what they legally owe. But the answer to balancing the budget is to slash the critical IRS funding and reverse this progress. Mr. Ford, how much does the IRS stand to return to the Treasury over the next 10 years due to tax enforcement of the wealthiest individuals and businesses?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I retired from the government a couple years ago. I don't have those exact figures, but the return on investment for IRS agents, whether it's on the civil or criminal side, is enormous. Just the criminal division of the IRS that I worked with for almost 30 years just over the last several years, identified many billions of dollars in tax and other financial fraud.
Yeah, I have a figure of 120 billion over 10 years. That's an enormous amount of money. Who pays the price of tax evasion by the wealthiest and large corporations, Mr. Ford?
Well, it's all the American citizens that are abiding by the laws.
Now, Dr. Sarin, I've led over 8 letters to the IRS about a range of customer service issues. I mean, at the essence, U.S. taxpayers should expect that you will answer the phone, you will answer the mail, you will process returns, at a minimum. That wasn't always the case. The IRS consistently now answers the phones between 80 and 90% of the time at an average speed answer of 4 minutes compared to previous times where that was incredibly longer. What would it mean, Dr. Sarin, for taxpayer customer service if my colleagues had their way in rescinding the IRS IRA funding?
Well, Senator Menendez, you would go back to the world of before, where less than 15% of calls that were made during filing season were answered, where phone wait times were upwards of 30 minutes, where the IRS continued a practice that it called a courtesy disconnect, which was essentially it knew it was never going to get to you, so it just would cancel your phone call when it received it. Now the IRS has the tools that it needs to be able to answer customer calls. About 90% of the time this filing season, it is going to aim for 100% of the time and instantaneous communications with taxpayers, and that's what these resources are going to afford it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think any of my constituents would appreciate a courtesy disconnect at the end of the day. Finally, it's not just IRS funding that our colleagues want to slash, but other critical government programs to grow jobs and the economy. Last year, Congress appropriated, for example, $8 billion to the child care and block development grants. This helps to provide funding for child care providers to support low-income families in assessing child care. And to do what largely? To be able to go to work, to be productive, to contribute to the economy. Dr. Sarin, what would be the impact on families, child care providers, and the economy writ large if Republicans insist on slashing vital funding for child care as a condition to a precedent on a debt default?
We have a whole host of empirical evidence on this question. It means less people able to work, less women able to work. It means worse outcomes for children in the long run. And fundamentally, we don't need to do that to address our debts and deficits. What we can do instead is collect the taxes that are already on the books with actions like the IRA's investment in the IRS.
I thank my colleague. The next 3 in order of appearance are Cardin, Bennett, and Warner, and I would say to my colleagues on both sides, we're getting ready to wrap up. Senator Cardin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I regret I have not been able to be here for the full hearing, but I certainly concur in a lot of the comments been made by my colleagues about the impact of the type of cuts that were in the Republican bill. One of the things that we want to do is have compliance with our tax laws. And the funds that were made available through the Inflation Reduction Act allow us to get a greater compliance on the tax laws that are on the books. I want to mention it, though, from a little bit different perspective, and that is the fairness to middle-income and lower-income families. My information shows that we have a higher compliance on the revenues from the middle-income families and lower-income families than we do from higher-income families. Secondly, just from the calls to our office, the service levels at the IRS are critically more important to middle-income families in complying with it. So if they can't get a phone call answered, they're going to be much more at risk than higher income that have other alternatives in order to understand their tax liability. So Dr. Sarin and Mr. Ford, if you could respond from the point of view that of the impact it has on different income levels, the fairness of our tax code. It already is not progressive from the point of view of those that are wealthiest paying the highest percentages on their taxes, basically because of so many of the loopholes we have and lack of enforcement. But how would the repeal of the IRA funding impact on the fairness to lower income and middle income families?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator Cardin. It's an incredibly important one. The vast majority of your constituents are fully compliant with their tax obligations. Wage and salary earners' taxes are automatically withheld. For high earners who earn income in opaque ways, things like proprietorship income or rental income, compliance rates are around 50%. So what that means is today, we have a two-tiered tax system where the vast majority of low-income and middle-income people are paying all that they owe, and wealthy tax evaders are getting to skirt the rules because the IRS has no capacity to enforce the laws against them. And that's why the Inflation Reduction Act is so important, because it finally gives the IRS what it needs to be able to go and hire people with expertise in partnerships who are going to be able to unpack thousands of pages of complex partnership returns, to hire data scientists and economists who are going to be able to leverage the type of information that comes on offshore bank accounts from the FATCA and actually deploy it in their enforcement choices and the ways in which they go about making sure that the wealthy play by the same set of rules as everyone else.
That 50% is kind of shocking, but not so we know about the $1 trillion tax gap right now. Mr. Ford, if you could talk a little bit about the service, importance of the IRS being able to provide timely information to those that are more modest in income, and the fact that if we don't maintain the funding that we've provided under the Inflation Reduction Act to improve the service levels at the IRS, the impact will be adversely impacted on middle-income and lower-income families.
Thanks for the question, Senator, and I completely agree with Dr. Sarin's comments. The world in which I lived in the IRS for 30 years was all on the criminal side, but I agree completely that, the bottom line is less money means less agents, less service, and less ability to really pinpoint in on, where the work and where the resources need to be deployed.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank my colleague. The next two senators have spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. I'm going to call on Senator Bennett and then Senator Warner.
Mr. Chairman, if I could go after Senator Warner, I'd be happy to defer to Senator Warner.
In the parlance of the Senate, they are yielding to their friends and all the rest. I'm happy to do that.
By after, I mean directly after.
Yeah, exactly. There is going to be no question that after Senator Warner will be Senator Bennett.
Senator Bennett, that is extremely gracious, and I will make my questioning very brief. I do want to say that I'm not really sure that Senator Cardin was here ahead of Senator Bennett and I, but we both have such respect for Senator Cardin. You may have known that we let him sit in your chair on the last hearing and offered the fact that if he would reconsider his decision not to run again, maybe we could work out something on a longer-term basis. I know you rushed back into the hearing after that.
It all sounds very collegial. I do want to
say
know
for the record,
Senator Cardin was here. Thank you.
I will be very brief. Dr. Sarin, it is great to see you. Thank you for your work. I do want to clarify, and I hope my Republican staff colleagues will bring this back to the other members. The question of funding IRS and tax savings was hugely bipartisan. In the infrastructure gang, there was agreement on using these funds. There was a question and concern that we might come back and double dip, but there was broad Republican agreement, maybe not at quite the $80 billion mark, but at least at 40, and I think we could have nudged to 60, that we would have had huge savings. There was concern that we might come back and whatever Build Back Better morphed into IRA and reuse it again. But so I hope, and I'll mention with Senator Tillis, there was a huge understanding of this. And frankly, the CBO estimate at the $80 billion saving 120 was at the low end of the estimates. There have been some, including Larry Summers and others, that thinks that the savings were extraordinarily higher. So, Dr. Sarin, I know Senator Menendez already raised this, and I desperately hope that what has been quietly agreed to as a bipartisan initiative doesn't get slowly chipped away. And I'd point out, Mr. Chairman, that if the House approach in their threat to have our country default were to be taken up, and if they were to exclude, a half dozen entities that they now decide they don't want to cut on the domestic side, like veterans and others, I believe they would take back all $80 billion, and on top of that, would potentially cut IRS an additional 30%. So the question when we have members that say, I want to make sure my phone call, my constituent's phone call is returned in a timely manner, we would take an organization that's already been decimated by cuts and send it right over the precipice. And I just don't get the fact that I know there's a reluctance from some of my Republican friends to ever look at the revenue side of the house, although all of us who were involved in debt and deficit issues earlier realized we had to do spending, but we had to do revenues. But the easiest place to do revenues is actually tax enforcement.
It certainly is, Senator Warner, and I will say that the lack of ability to collect 2% of GDP on an annualized basis, that's $600 billion that is just sitting there to help us address our fiscal sustainability concerns.
And we've had this tax season came out relatively well. I wish we'd have a little more revenue, so we have a little more time on the attempts for some to have our nation default. But just very briefly, since I said I was not going to take all my time and get back to Senator Bennett, one of the things that I've raised in this committee with Commissioner Warfel is to make sure that the employer retention tax credit, we're seeing some of that process speed up. We've had a lot of Virginia business. I know there's a lot of Colorado businesses as well. But if we were to cut back these funds, wouldn't that just make the problem worse? And aren't we, a lot of priorities at the IRS, but isn't the commissioner starting to knock those down? And somewhat the successful rate we've seen recently is a step in the right direction.
Certainly, and he says that they're going to be able to double them now that filing season is over. But I will say, Senator Warner, that the way we got into this situation with small businesses waiting in limbo with the IRS was precisely because we had a decimated agency that couldn't do this work. And that's why the IRA is so
I'm going to
important.
ask you to cut off because Senator Bennett will never be gracious again if I don't stop at this point. Thank you, Mr.
Well said, Senator Warner. Senator Bennett.
Not about the gracious part, but about the... Just to follow up on your answer to Senator Warner, Dr. Sirin, when you say the $600 billion is just sitting there, what do you mean it's just sitting there?
What I mean is that today, the difference between the taxes that are owed based on the tax law that is on the books and what the IRS is able to collect is around $600 billion a year. Left unaddressed over the course of the next decade, that's going to be $7.8 trillion that disproportionately comes from a tax evasion benefit to the top 1%.
And that's what I was going to ask you about. So so you're saying that $600 billion that is owed and it's known that it's owed.
Correct. And that's actually an understatement of true evasion in the economy because we know that high-income individuals and complex partnerships are able to hide their income even from the audits we use to measure the tax gap.
And so how is that $600 billion? I mean, can you talk just a little bit about how that's calculated in this sense? Are you talking about people that have filed with the IRS and obscured the reality of their tax liability, or are you talking about people that just have never filed with the IRS? How to add up that $600 billion?
Absolutely. So what I'm talking about, where the IRS has relatively good measurements of evasion, is with respect to the individual income tax gap, where it does random audit studies and it looks at the difference between what you report or whether or not you file and what you actually owed. But what we know is that the top of the distribution isn't actually even able, it is able to conceal its true income position even from those audits. We know that between 2014 and 2016, 100 of the wealthiest non-filers, people who did the most blatant kind of evasion, which is not even file their taxes, were responsible for $10 billion of lost revenue to the fisc.
And of the $600 billion, that's an annual number.
That is an annual number.
So what is that? Why is that an annual number? That's something, so every year there's the gap that you're talking about.
Correct. Each and every year we fail to collect around $600 billion.
To the American people, the other taxpayers are actually paying what's owed. If it's $600 billion a year, and then it's another $600 billion a year, and another $600 billion a year.
It creates, and we haven't gotten, I'm so grateful to the question because it's an opportunity to comment on the fact that you have a system where for any new fiscal needs that the government identifies, the only group that bears the costs of those needs are the group of taxpayers that are complying with their tax obligations. So you have a real competitive distortion in the economy where certain types of wealthy taxpayers just don't pay what they owe.
I don't have my calculator with me, but I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, you could pay for a lot of the child tax credit with that $600 billion.
You certainly can, Senator.
If you wanted to. I would, just the remaining time that I have left, I want to thank the chair for holding this meeting. And the reason I want to thank you is that I've talked to families and small businesses all over Colorado, and I've heard that they expect the IRS to work quickly to get Coloradans their returns, which they don't get them, and they expect to have some decent customer support. And the IRS, when we passed the child tax credit, we passed the earned income tax credit, the enhancements to those things, that was a lot of work, but people were able to benefit from that, and they were able to do it in real time. And I think that's because a lot of us were pushing really hard, but I think Coloradans and people all over this country deserve a 21st century tax administrator, one that answers the phone when they call, and that allows them to upload documents electronically. It flags easy to fix errors in their returns. This sounds like hocus pocus or magic, but it's the way a lot of other tax systems in the industrialized world work. It's not the way our system works. And it's one of the reasons, frankly, why it's so easy to get away with the kind of tax fraud that you're talking about, the cheating that you're talking about. And the people that are not benefiting from that are working people who are trying to get the benefit of their credit back from the IRS and can't do it because they haven't been able to get their phone calls returned, or because the agency's running software that was written in the 1960s. And no offense to the 1960s, but I think we can do better than that. So I hope for anything else, Mr. President, out of this, that you're able to pull some of the politics out of this issue, that we can put people back to work so they can be responsive to the people we represent, and we can get on to the matters that really are of concern to the American people, which is having a tax code that actually supports working people and their efforts in an economy where for 50 years all the benefits have accrued to the people at the very top. So thanks for having me, and thanks for having this hearing.
Sums it up. Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Forte, I'm going to direct this first question to you. The power of the Supreme Court to impact Nevadans' lives every day is clearer than ever before. The Citizens United decision in 2010 led to a dark money spending spree where groups could influence our elections with billions in new spending from the shadows, absent any clear guidance or enforcement. Our elections have become vulnerable to bad actors and foreign interference without sufficient transparency into who is behind these campaigns. Foreign political contributions are illegal under campaign finance law. It is extremely difficult to enforce these, since these groups do not disclose information publicly or to the IRS about their funding sources. The GAO found that the IRS doesn't check for illegal foreign money in U.S. elections. This is why last Congress I joined the Spotlight Act with Senators Tester and Wyden and the Disclose Act with Senator Whitehouse to increase transparency and disclosure of donors by political, special interests, and malicious actors. So, Mr. Fort, I guess my question to you is, how does the lack of investment harm the IRS's ability for due diligence to create better transparency and accountability regarding the influence of dark money groups?
Thanks for the question, Senator. So my entire career was with the criminal side of the IRS, so I didn't work in the civil side of the IRS, so I can't address that part of the question. I can tell you from a criminal standpoint, that's a type of work that the IRS special agents would be involved with the Department of Justice and other federal agencies to address that from a criminal standpoint. As a general comment from my experience and background, the years of budget cuts and stagnant budget means, less application of resources to those type of critical areas that you mentioned.
Well, and that's the point, right? We're hearing more budget cuts, right? Already the IRS is underfunded because of all of the cuts. What I hear some of my Republican colleagues continuing to want to cut even the additional resources that we put into the IRS just to catch up, right? And so it's going to have a devastating impact on the IRS and its ability to enforce, whether that's civil or criminal. Is that correct?
Yes, I agree. I would agree they're at a breaking point, and it would be catastrophic at this point.
Mr. Sepp, let me ask you this. The National Taxpayers Advocate's annual report to Congress highlights the continuing inability for taxpayers with questions to reach the IRS. While we have seen awesome growth in responses, the IRS is still playing catch-up when it comes to implementing technologies to make customer service more efficient. Your testimony notes that the IRS must learn to talk before it runs regarding IT. However, this is simply the IRS playing catch-up while technology continues to advance. How can the IRS take a dual approach to improve its cybersecurity while moving forward with its technological advancements?
Well, the addition of a CIO, Senator, to the IRS has been helpful. I have to think that there needs to be closer management of both tracks through something like an IRS Oversight Board. I also think there has to be a new philosophy toward compliance in the electronic sphere. The legislation that you and Senator Blackburn introduced to put parity between mail and electronic communications with the IRS is very important. It's insane that online filers who owe money don't get the same kind of deference as somebody who throws a check in the mailbox. They automatically become non-compliant if they don't have a certain number of hours before filing their payment on time. That makes absolutely no sense. So it is a managerial issue as well as a funding issue. The priorities are going to have to be established, especially in the electronic infrastructure. We talk about putting the cart before the horse. We haven't really even built the barn yet when it comes to cybersecurity infrastructure. If we're going to go after cyber criminals for revenues, the IRS needs much more robust infrastructure to be able to handle that.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Sarin, in a 2020 article with Larry Summer and Charles Rosati, you discussed how unpaid taxes total more than all the individual income taxes paid by the lowest 90% of earners. You note that the top 1% of earners are responsible for at least 30% of the tax gap. Likewise, in your testimony, you highlighted that if the United States was able to collect the taxes that were already on the books, deficits would shrink by nearly half. We are on the verge of financial catastrophe by defaulting on our debts. It's a conversation that, unfortunately, the Republican speaker refuses to take off the table. Per your testimony, the Inflation Reduction Act can help ensure that we reduce the amount of debt that we owe. That's correct.
That is absolutely correct.
So if we repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, which again, Speaker McCarthy and some of the right-wing Republicans in the House want to do, how can we then actually tackle the tax gap?
You can't. And what happens is that in the context of a conversation about the debt ceiling and the importance of addressing our deficits, you actually have some who are arguing for a measure that we know will add to the deficit and be a tax cut for the wealthy and large corporations who are evading their fair share.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. We've got senators, I believe, coming. I want to ask a question of you, Dr. Sarin, with respect to gift tax audits. Intentionally failing to file a return is a crime, but some very affluent individuals still don't file gift tax returns. The IRS examined just 95 gift tax returns in 2019. That is an audit rate of about 0.04%, 20 times lower than the rate at which the IRS audited returns claiming the earned income tax credit. Professor Sarin, in your view, what would repealing IRA funding do to the IRS's ability to police gift and estate tax compliance by the very affluent?
Thank you so much for the question, Senator. This came up in actually some of my early work on tax administration. The estate tax rate is something like 40%. The effective estate tax is around 13.5%. There are a lot of tricks people play. Some are legal, some are illegal, to avoid their estate and gift tax obligations. And this should be an area of high focus for the agency going forward. And it's an area where you're absolutely right. Capacity is totally depleted. Estate tax and gift tax audit rates are essentially zero today. but a decade ago, they were only 1%. So it's not like this is an area where the IRS has historically had the capacity to invest. Finally, we're giving them the tools they need and the resources they need and the stability of multi-year funding to actually be able to invest in hiring the type of experts who are going to be able to unpack all of these tricks. And what that's going to do directly is raise more revenue, but also what it's going to do indirectly is encourage less of the gamesmanship and make sure that people, especially the very wealthiest who are so privileged in this economy, are able to pay their fair share.
Thank you. Senator Brown.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I apologize. I'm having a banking hearing with the CEOs of
Doing important work.
Silicon Valley Bank. Thank you, and I won't keep you long. It will not be the whole 5 minutes. I recently introduced the Fend Off Fentanyl Act, a bipartisan bill to help prevent increasingly dangerous forms of fentanyl from reaching communities in Oregon and Ohio and elsewhere by going after it at the source, the transnational criminal organizations and the money launderers that make their profits possible. Stemming the flow of fentanyl is a bipartisan priority. It requires a cross-government effort. The IRS Criminal Investigation Unit plays an important role in that effort. Mr. Fort, what would happen to IRS efforts to help stop the flow of fentanyl into our community if the IRS resources were cut back?
Thank you for the question, Senator. A reduction or cut in the funding would mean less cases. Exactly the type of cases you're talking about. They have primary responsibility over tax crimes, but very broad authority in the types of cases you talked about, multi-agency narcotics investigations, terrorist financing, things like that. A cut in the budget would put those cases at serious risk.
Thank you. I understand in the case you cited earlier in your testimony that the payments largely occurred in cryptocurrency. Tell us what the IRS is uniquely positioned, why the IRS is uniquely positioned to combat crimes happening with cryptocurrency.
It's a great question. So what IRS special agents bring to the table is the ability to follow the money. Other federal agencies have other strengths and do amazing work, but following the money is critical to taking down these type of criminal organizations. IRS-CI has been at the lead and the forefront in investigating crimes around cryptocurrency, back from the days of Silk Road, Alpha Bay, BTCE, Welcome to Video, the list goes on and on. They really have been leading the charge in those investigations.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thanks all.
Thank you, Senator Brown, for bringing up fentanyl cases in particular. Oregon has been hit very, very hard by these fentanyl criminals, and you brought up a case. I asked Mr. Ford about it as well. These are the real-world consequences of what it means to basically let these McCarthy budgets slash enforcement funding, and I thank you for coming in. You all have been very patient, and I thank you for it. This has been a very instructive kind of hearing. And if I were to sum it up, I've heard mentioned by our witnesses, I've heard a senator or two mention it, guardrails make common sense, and I can work on those in a bipartisan way. But make no mistake about it, the first bill that came out of the House was not about guardrails. It was about tossing the additional enforcement money into the trash can. And what we have seen is examples today with respect to the real world kind of benefits in terms of service and fighting, tax cheats. Mr. Edwards, I really noted your comment about the strategic operating plan having good things in it. I think those were exactly your words. And I'm going to recognize my colleague from Washington, who's been a very strong advocate of defending taxpayers and making sure service is good. With just my last comment, we can tackle these issues in a bipartisan way. I wrote 2 comprehensive tax reform bills, one with Judd Gregg and one with Senator Coates, who sat over there. And it incorporated a number of the ideas we're talking about today. In fact, unless my memory fails me, I think Mr. Edwards, your organization was very helpful. And what we said is we're going to give everybody in America the chance to get ahead. We're going to be for innovation. We're going to be for fairness. Democrats and Republicans, we can tackle these issues in a bipartisan way. I don't think we're going to be able to tackle them if we just say we're going to toss all the new enforcement money in the trash can. And a number of you avoided saying that today. And I noted it, and I noted your comment, Mr. Edwards, with respect to the benefits of the strategic operating plan. So after Senator Cantwell finishes, we'll wrap up, but we're interested in talking to all four of you in the days ahead. You have a lot of experience in this area, and we get common ground between people who can have different views. That's what fixing the tax code is all about, and that's what I've been all about since the years when I had a full head of hair and rugged good looks. So we'll look forward to talking to you, Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know that there's been many members here and asking various questions, but I have definitely been asking lots of questions about the backlog at the IRS and communication. And the Inflation Reduction Act, actually, there are a number of enhancements to customer service, such as improved phone service, self-account services. It allows them to interact with the IRS, manage payments and funds. So what does anybody think the future of this looks like, down the road, that we bring the level of efficiency to this system? I see Dr. Stern, you're nodding, so you must know the most about this or have a vision about it.
Well, Senator Cantwell, I think that's an incredibly important question, and I will say a couple of things in response. One is that the type of backlogs that you're speaking to, what happened during the pandemic, the fact that the IRS walked into tax year 2021 with 20 million unprocessed returns, that will never happen again, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. It will never happen again because you have given the IRS the tools that it needs to fundamentally digitize its operations such that it's not people, currently today, it is people hand transcribing line items from paper returns. The world of the future is here, and it's here. The IRS is the only organization that functions this way today. We should be able to instantaneously scan and digitize that information so that returns are processed instantaneously. And that is what you have given the IRS the tools to do. During the pandemic, the IRS answered less than 15% of taxpayer calls. That is because it did not have people to put on the phones. Thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS does. And you have seen instantaneous changes with respect to something like an 87% level of service. The IRS of the future is going to be an IRS where, just like you communicate with your financial institution, you can deposit checks instantaneously on your phone, you can reach someone in live time. That is the future that the IRS is going to be able to build now that it has these resources. And the American taxpayers should be incredibly excited about what it means to be in a country where you have a tax administrator that's in the 21st century.
What else do we need to do you think, to make sure that that happens and stays consistent to that vision that you're articulating?
I think there is a real risk, and it's been unfortunate to observe over the course of the last several months, calls for rescinding these funds, because rescinding these funds puts the IRS back into the dark ages. What also will put the IRS back into the dark ages is if in the discretionary appropriations process, we diminish from the IRS to use these IRA funds to do this transformative 21st century building a new IRS work by making them use their discretionary funds to plug holes in day-to-day operations if we don't give them what they need in the discretionary process to continue to answer those phones and to continue to pay the workforce that they already have.
Well, I think also in the information, having worked in software, I mean, one of the things you want to know right away is like, what's the most prevailing problem that people have? And then you want to be able to communicate about that. And I would think that that's, in that backlog and in the questions, you could see where there's a sticking point, particularly when there were some changes, to the code, and you knew that people were going to have a tough time understanding that. So it just seems like that would also give the IRS the ability to look at what's not being communicated or what some of the problems are and be able to try to address them. Or to say, look, this is where all these cases are left, or this is why we're having a backlog, or here's who we're having a backlog with, or it's this segment of the population. So I'm glad that you think that this resource is going to go where we need to go for the future, because I totally agree. We have to be, the IRS has to be a digital IRS for sure. And this is where we improve service improve communications, and give people answers. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. What a fitting kind of ending to make the technology initiative that's in front of the IRS the last subject, and I thank you all. With respect to the rules of the committee, all members have to get back to us within 1 week by 5 o'clock, and to all our witnesses for their patience and professionalism, I thank you. The Finance Committee is adjourned.